Saving Walt, Chapter 4. Turbulence. The plane shook, and Roy Disney could feel his lunch churning in his stomach. His little brother, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the dips and dives that went with air travel. Walt seemed completely oblivious to the fact that the company lost Kay Kamen, their first head of product merchandising, in a plane crash 14 years prior. But that was his brother, always ignoring the risks. The pilot emerged from the cockpit and said, "Sorry about the turbulence, Mr. Disney."
Call me Walt.
"We should be passing into Florida any second." Walt seemed excited. He looked out the window, but then walked towards the cockpit. Roy instantly knew what his brother was thinking.
Walt, maybe we should let the pilot do his job.
But Walt just ignored his brother and entered the cockpit.
You know, I took some flying lessons years ago. Roy made me stop,
Walt said, clearly loud enough that Roy could hear him. Roy didn't mind the comment, but letting his brother fly the plane, that scared him. Roy looked to Card Walker, the company's vice president in charge of marketing. Roy could see the look of worry on Card's face, but he knew Card would never dare question Walt to his face. Whenever his brother was being unreasonable, everyone came to Roy, hoping he'd make his little brother see reason. So Roy put his papers down and walked into the cockpit. Roy saw his brother eagerly pressing buttons and flipping switches.
You know, the first Mickey Mouse cartoon was about Mickey learning to fly a plane. Everyone was going crazy about Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. Well, we promised the insurance companies you wouldn't fly anymore.
But his brother paid him no mind. Of course, Walt had readily agreed to the contract years ago. He had wanted to take out a life insurance policy for his wife and 2 daughters, but no insurance company was going to cover him unless he agreed to stop piloting. At the time, that was all the confirmation Roy needed to know that flying was dangerous, and the loss of Kay only solidified that fact. Roy was thankful for anything that helped keep his brother safely on the ground.
Walt,
Roy began, but then the pilot piped up. "You know, I saw victory through air power." And that was all Walt needed to hear. Walt began regaling the pilot with the story of how the Disney studio created an animated film to convince FDR to use the full force of America's fledgling Air Force to invade Germany during World War II. Walt stopped pressing the buttons on the plane and began using his hands to mimic flying scenes from the movie. He spoke with such passion and enthusiasm. He was 61 years old, but he still had the joy of a child. But like a child, Walt could be naive, which repeatedly got him into trouble. After Pearl Harbor, Walt had been so keen to do his duty for America, he agreed to do a number of films for the government without reading the fine print.
billions for defense, but not $1 for Donald Duck. That's what some egghead congressman told me.
Roy realized that the "not $1" comment from August Bush had probably killed the deal. World War II was a tough time for the studio. Most of Congress was against any funding for their studio. FDR had agreed to fund some of their projects, but only at cost. Roy was barely able to keep the lights on. But now all the politicians lined up to kiss his brother's boots. Roy was proud of his brother, and as he watched Walt continue his story, Roy felt guilty standing over his brother's shoulder. He felt like a prudish high school chaperone trying to protect the virtue of the female students at the prom. But then Walt leaned in and grabbed the joystick.
Now, if I press down, we'll go up, right?
The nose of the plane tilted up. Roy grabbed the cockpit door to balance himself.
Walt, I promised Diane and Sharon you'd never fly again. Are you going to make a liar out of me?
Roy knew it was an act of manipulation, using Walt's daughters like that. But it was a small price to pay to ensure that everyone on board didn't die in a horrific crash. Walt shot Roy a look of defiance, as if to say, "You can't tell me what to do." But Walt stood up and walked out of the cockpit. Roy exhaled.
Roy, you look like you need a drink.
Walt motioned for the stewardess, who poured all the men a drink. But Roy didn't partake. He had to finish going over his reports. Roy looked back through the St. Louis proposal. It was actually quite solid, but then August Busch had to go and open up his mouth. Truth be told, Roy couldn't be too angry at him. It wasn't unreasonable to ask for product placement if you're forking over a few million. But Walt stuck to his guns. Roy knew that his dad would have been pleased with that, but he would have been equally displeased at the thought of Walt enjoying a cocktail in the middle of the day on a private jet. Roy suspected that Walt had already made his mind up about Florida before they even went to St. Louis. But he had no idea why Walt would go to all that trouble for a proposal he had no intention of forwarding. Florida certainly made sense financially, but half the state was one big giant swamp. Something on the outskirts of Miami seemed far more practical, Roy had concluded. But moments later, the pilot came out and announced that they were passing over Orlando. Walt's face lit up, and he looked out the window and began pointing below. But all Roy saw was a massive green sea of bogs and marshes.
And the hotels could go there, and I want monorails connecting all of them, you know? Monorails are expensive,
Roy thought to himself. But he saw the look of wonder in his brother's eyes, and he knew better than to verbalize his concern. He looked at Card Walker nodding, enraptured in Walt's vision. Card Walker was manipulative and ambitious. Roy reckoned that anyone who dealt with journalists all day had to be. But at least Card didn't believe in paying for advertising. They both shared the philosophy that the only publicity worth paying for is free publicity. But despite Card's incessant bootlicking, Roy knew Card Walker was a true believer. When Walt spoke, Card saw a vision of the future. Roy just saw the company going into the red. Card could fellowship his brother in a way he never could.
But why not?
Roy wondered. He had seen his brother produce miracle after miracle with a resolve and determination unlike anything he had ever seen. His brother had proved the naysayers wrong countless times, even when Roy was convinced it wouldn't work. Walt always made it work, and so Roy chided himself for always being a wet rag. He had an imagination. It was nothing compared to his brother's, but he could envision things. So Roy walked over to his brother and peered out the window, trying to see the magic.
I want the castle to be twice as big as Disneyland. I want people to be able to experience the castles of Europe, you know?
Roy saw a nearby highway and pointed to it.
Wouldn't it be fantastic if we put the castle at the front of the park, near the highway, so families could see it driving in from miles away? I think that'd be pretty swell.
But when Card Walker's jaw dropped wide open, Roy knew it would not be swell. Walt gave his older brother a look as if he had just broken wind in front of the Queen of England.
Roy, it would be Anaheim all over again. What do you mean? Do you really want people to see Sleeping Beauty's castle while they're pulling into McDonald's? Where's the magic in that? Well, I tried,
Roy thought to himself. He sheepishly went back over to his seat and buried his head into the financial projections of the next theme park. Project X, as his brother had named it, would cost at least $100 million, probably 2 or 3. And so Roy spent the next few hours dreaming of ways to generate that kind of money. When it came to conjuring up money, Roy had more imagination than anyone, even Walt.
Folks, we have to make an emergency landing. Please take your seats and buckle up.
What's wrong?
Roy yelled at the cockpit.
We don't know.
We don't know is not something Roy wanted to hear.
This is it. It's Kate Cayman all over again. All because my little brother had to have 2 theme parks. One just wasn't enough.
Mr. Disney, please take your seat, the stewardess said. Roy looked down and realized he was standing. His instinct was to flee, but on a plane, there was nowhere to go. Roy felt his balance giving way to the descending plane, and so he dutifully sat down and buckled his seatbelt.
Not that seatbelts will do any good at this height.
Roy studied the face of the stewardess, trying to assess her level of worry. But she wasn't giving anything away. He looked at his brother, who again didn't seem to appreciate the gravity of the situation. He seemed to think this was one of his rides. The two brothers made eye contact.
Roy, everything'll be fine. How do you know that? Because if something was really wrong, we wouldn't have time to debate it.
His brother could always remain preternaturally calm in times like this, but that's because his brother never appreciated genuine risks. Roy began to imagine what Kay Kamen must have thought right before his plane went down over Portugal. Probably what Roy was thinking now.
I'm gonna die because of Walt's flights of fancy.
Roy didn't really believe he was safe until he heard the wheels of the plane skid against the airport tarmac.
Well, that was a gas.
Roy rolled his eyes at his brother's quip. The plane rolled into the private terminal, and when the flight attendant opened the door, Roy felt the sweetest sense of relief. He would have kissed the ground if it weren't so dirty. Everyone descended out of the plane and into the airport lounge, but his sense of relief gave way to worry as he looked around inside. The private terminal was jam-packed with people. Most of the women were in tears, and Roy noticed men taking off their hats. Airport workers were scurrying around frantically.
What happened?
The president's been shot.
Oh my God.
Now it all made sense. The emergency landing, the tears, the bowed heads. Card Walker began interrogating the airport staff, demanding answers. The president was gone. But they caught the man who did it, although details were scant. Roy didn't know what to think. The president was so young, so full of promise. Roy hadn't voted for him, but he liked Kennedy. A wave of guilt suddenly came over him. John F. Kennedy had attended a conference at the Disneyland Hotel as a senator in 1959, but Walt barely acknowledged his presence. Richard Nixon was the senator from California before becoming vice president, so the Disney brothers had a long history with him. And Nixon had always been gracious enough to visit the theme park on multiple occasions, so the Disney brothers didn't really rate Kennedy. But now Roy wished that he had. He should have made Walt meet him. He should have done something. Not that that would have made any difference, but still.
His poor wife. And the kids.
Roy sat down in one of the nearby lounge chairs. He exhaled. He looked at Card Walker, who was busy yapping away at someone else.
Everyone moves through grief differently.
Roy knew Card wasn't trying to be mean. He just sprung into action as a way to handle the stress, as if being efficient and managing the details would somehow help the situation. The president was dead. Getting back to California seemed insignificant in comparison. Roy then looked at his little brother. All signs of jubilation were gone. His brow was furrowed. He looked almost angry. Walt exhaled a puff of smoke and took another drag from the cigarette he was smoking. Walt was almost down to the filter, but he kept inhaling. His deep brown eyes were lost in thought, staring out the window, as if he were trying to make out a far-off object. Walt didn't grieve like everybody else. When he felt pain, he would withdraw, go silent, and Roy knew to let his brother process his grief in his own way. But as Roy continued to observe Walt, he noticed his brother using his finger to make a circular motion in the air. And Roy could see resolve solidifying behind his brother's burning gaze. But resolve to do what? This has been Chapter 4 of Saving Walt by Andrew L. Young. It was read and performed by Owen McEwen with the voice talents of Paul Fowles. If you enjoyed this broadcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're in a position to help, please feel free to visit our Patreon page, Andrew Creates. It really helps us out a lot. Thank you.